Мне хочу представить профессора Эндрю Лэрда из университета Королевства из Англии. Профессор Лэрд занимается латинской литературой. Длинный список тех мест, где профессор Лэрд работал, включает в себя и Англию, и Соединенные Штаты, Принстон, Мэдисон, Висконсин, и Мексику, и годичную стажировку в Саламанке докторскую. И я думаю, что я должен особенно подчеркнуть, что профессор Лэрд занимается Африкой Петрарки. То, чем занимался я, это ну, а то, что все сюжеты в основном связаны с латинской литературой.
Very much. That sounded right. And thank you to everyone who's invited us and made this trip so comfortable and enjoyable, as well as stimulating and impressive. Arnaldo Mamigliano saw a problem with the way Greek biographers portrayed character on the basis of evidence when they attempted to write lives of poets. The trouble was, as Mamigliano pointed out, that the Greek biographers could not infer anything about the character of Euripides from his tragedy Hippolytus in the same way that they could make inferences about the character of Miltiades from his performance as a general at Marathon. And here Mamigliano was in accord with Mary Lefkowitz, whose book he quoted, and the thinking in the lives of the Greek poets still influences general thinking of scholars today about ancient poetic biography. This paper will be concerned with the inferences ancient readers made about the poet Virgil from his poetry. And the aim is partly to approach a re-evaluation of the Latin tradition of Virgilian biography, not as history, but as a form of exegesis that can be conceived as something akin to literary criticism. I'll begin with Suetonius' account of literary interpretation and the significance of his story of Virgil's request to burn the Aeneid before addressing a bigger issue, the dramatization of the poet's presence by ancient readers, even as a visible apparition, and the significance of all this for the performance and reception of Virgil's work. And all these considerations are really connected. There's a consensus between some early Roman responses to Virgil and the traditions of commentary on the poet from later in antiquity. Early sources which show an interest in the development of Virgil's work over time convey a strong sense of the poet as an individual person, while the later material presents Virgil as an instructor of poetic technique and rhetoric, and sometimes philosophy. He's regarded as someone who composes to be heard as well as read, and in both kinds of case, the role ascribed to the poet by his ancient readers amounts to a dramatic role. English-speaking scholars never seem to discuss the last part of Suetonius' life of Virgil, which explains how to introduce a formal study of the poet's work. And their failure to notice this passage is probably because Rolf's popular Loeb translation doesn't include it. The last part of the text, 47 to 66, was a kind of coda to the biographical narrative. But what Suetonius says about the subject of what is usually treated before the work, quod tractari solet ante opus, is fascinating. And you can see from this passage that inference or construction of the author from the work is what's at stake. It's made clear that treatment of the title, the cause, and the intention of the work should be conducted before one gets on to the work itself. Yet, as Suetonius' own method of elucidation of the bucolics shows, his account of Virgil's title, of authorial identity, and of the cause and intention of his poetry comes from a reading of the poems themselves. Suetonius introduces the idea of pseudepigraphy too. Pseudepigrapha are defined as works put out under another's name by being falsely signed. And Suetonius says some people falsely attributed the Thyestes to Virgil. He next contrasts the bucolics as being clearly by the poet, and his evidence comes from the testimony at the end of the Georgics, in which Virgil referred back to his bucolics as Carmina Pastorum. It's still customary to treat the words of the Georgics as those of Virgil's individual persona, and some people still conceive of one or two speakers in the eclogues as mouthpieces of the poet. But the manner in which modern readers and scholars approach the Aeneid is very different from the way it was read in antiquity. The heroic epic is routinely regarded as presenting a window which looks directly onto the events, characters, and historical concerns of the story. Extensive attention has been paid to the speech of the characters in the poem and to the empathy and point of view of its narrator, but very little emphasis is placed on the fact that out of all the characters in the Aeneid, the one who is the most conspicuous is Virgil, the poet, whose speaking voice and whose language mediates to the audience the actions, speeches, and everything else to be discerned in the text. Suetonius also makes inferences about the poet from the unfinished, or at least incomplete state of the text of the Aeneid, when he recounts the story of Virgil's request to destroy his work on his deathbed. And those inferences made by Suetonius have profound consequences for literary criticism in general. The importance of the tradition that Virgil wanted to burn the Aeneid really lies in some burning questions it raises about the relation between Virgil, the author, on the one hand, and his corpus of poetry on the other. The implications of the poet's request to incinerate his masterpiece can be regarded as a sort of parable about literary interpretation, which can be taken in more than one way. First, the literal meaning is one on which Virgil's critics, ancient and modern, have frequently depended. The story tells us that the Aeneid is imperfect, only because it was incomplete. This eventually led to attempts by Latin poets to finish the Aeneid by tacking on new endings which they wrote themselves, but there's a more common way of setting Virgil right. In the 1st century AD, the philosopher Favorinus was bold enough to identify the verses about Mount Etna in Book 3 of the Aeneid as one of the passages that needed revising and correction, confident as he was in his knowledge that the poet had not been able to polish and refine his poem completely. Suetonius follows his account of the incomplete state of the Aeneid by listing the Roman grammarians who tried to correct or improve Virgil's text, and then those who sought to point out his more general defects. Even in our own time, scholars have sought to make corrective judgments not just on the handful of incomplete verses, but on certain lines or passages of their own choosing. The idea that Virgil was unsure of his epic can encourage more critical verdicts of his poetry. The idea reassures people that, though Virgil was a great poet, he had limits to his capacities. The other way of understanding the story in Suetonius has a more profound significance for literary criticism and literary history. The possibility that Virgil wanted his epic to be destroyed could show us that what the poet wants is not always what is best for the poem. In continuing to preserve and read the Aeneid, we are disregarding the poet's wishes. Or, to present this another way, the Aeneid has a life of its own, which its poet would have denied. In that sense, it's more ours than his, more the property of the reader or audience than the author. By disregarding the mortal Virgil's wishes, one can create an immortal Virgil whose words have different messages for different people in different times. By disregarding the mortal poet's wishes, other things can be created too. Poetry modelled on Virgil, pseudepigraphic poetry which parodies or fakes Virgil, and even centos. To produce a cento must surely be the most decisive way of disregarding the wishes of the late Publius Vigilius Mara. The idea that readers have more rights than authors, or that poems are more important than poets, could well arise from reflecting on the story that the dying poet wanted to burn the Aeneid. And that idea would be all the more likely to arise among devotees of Virgil who considered that story to be true. The next issue identified here, the emphasis on or a desire for the poet's presence, eases the tension between Virgil, the author, and Virgil, the body of texts. The texts can themselves be used to reconstruct an idea or a dramatic re-presentation of the author who wrote them. It may seem obvious that the poet, as he is apprehended through his works, is a speaking character with individual qualities. But properly taking on board the conception of Virgil as a constant dramatised presence can help to make some ancient responses to his work look much less puzzling or irrelevant. Modern readers are often daunted or repelled by Virgil's early critics. They are confronted by a Scylla and Charybdis, grammatical, rhetorical interpretation on the one side and allegorical criticism on the other. But these general approaches to Virgil's poetry make more sense if it's understood that presuppositions about the centrality of the poet's role underline them both. Tiberius Claudius Donatus made this very explicit for rhetorical criticism in his ever unpopular commentary on the Aeneid, which presented the poet's main purpose as to provide an encomium of Aeneas. Aeneas, though, was not the only one to benefit from Virgil's oratorical expertise, according to Donatus. In a comment on Aeneid 624, describing Pasiphae's passion for the Cretan bull, which led to the birth of the Minotaur, Donatus showed how successful Virgil was at exonerating the bull from any blame. Overall, there is no doubt that the 1,200 pages of Donatus's 4th century commentary gave Virgil the starring role. The same assumption about the poet's priority was also made by the speakers in Macrobius's Saturnalia, just as it had been by Quintilian 3 centuries before. When all these authorities agreed that Virgil should be counted as an orator no less than as a poet, they were thinking more about his discourse as a whole than about the speeches he ascribed to his characters, while critics today concerned with rhetoric on the Aeneid, on the other hand, are mainly interested in those embedded speeches. But even if those late antique commentators had chosen to address Virgil as a poet instead of as an orator, Virgil's style, diction, and voice would still have been put centre stage, not his characters, his stories, or any general message or moral. That's roughly what the famous commentary of Servius does. Its principal object of attention is the poet. The glosses or explanations of Virgil's language in Servius exhibit a determination to reach the character of Virgil by recognising the individuality and the quality of the poet's expression. All those notes in the Servian corpus about Roman religion, myth and history also reflect the same inclination to understand and appreciate what it was that Virgil himself meant to say. In commenting on what is now conceived as narrative technique, Servius gives extensive consideration to persona, a word which refers us straight back to the character of the poet. Allegorical interpreters of Virgil in late antiquity also strove to recognise, or at least to construct, the character of the poet they addressed, for all that they are now regularly accused of imposing alien, anachronistic meanings onto his text. For example, Fulgentius's allegorical commentary on the Aeneid was a dramatic dialogue in which the ghost of Virgil explained his own work. Fulgentius himself was only relaying these moral and philosophical interpretations to his readers. The Scylla and Charybdis of early Virgilian interpretation end up looking rather similar. Neither approach presents Virgil's content in the ways it's currently regarded today, as political literature in the form of a third-person fiction where the Aeneid is concerned. But both those late antique approaches instead take us to the presence of Virgil, whose voice is directly heard. His own voice, whether it seemed to belong to an orator or a philosopher, is heard in the way that he uses words and figures. The rhetoricians were concerned with how Virgil deploys those words and figures. The allegorists sought to uncover the meanings lurking behind them. The poet's presence may at first seem to be quite different from the poet's voice, which is generally equated with the voice of the narrator. But the emphasis Virgil's earlier readers have placed on him being dead, the issue remaining for the next part of my discussion, should show that the most palpable conceptions of Virgil's presence, which involve phantom apparitions, might be on a continuum with more routine ways of reading or hearing the poet. Jackson Knight, an English translator and commentator on Virgil, notoriously sought to consult the ghost of Virgil through a psychic medium. The involvement of Virgil's ghost with the reception and exegesis of his poetry has been an enduring one. Long before Dante, Latin writers played on the idea of Virgil inhabiting the underworld of his own invention and occasionally coming back to haunt them. That has to be due in part to the powerful account of the underworld in Aeneid 6, which receives special attention from Roman poets after Virgil, as well as from all the commentators I've already mentioned. Scholars of the classical tradition have given the enduring impact of Aeneid 6 ample coverage. Here it's worth just considering the effect of one passage in which Virgil explicitly invokes the shades of the dead to reveal hidden knowledge. You gods who hold power over the spirits, you silent shades, chaos and phlegophone, let it be granted by your power to reveal things hidden deep in the darkness of the earth. This is an example of sciomancy, the alternative to necromancy, as a way of talking to the dead or securing a passport to the realms below. Servius defined sciomancy as umbra evocatio, the evocation of a shade, and that's exactly what the poet is doing in this passage, in his own voice. These verses naturally confirmed early readers in their belief that there were deeper levels of occult meaning in Virgil's poetry. And the matter might have been further complicated in later antiquity when the word umbra could come to mean allegory, as well as shadow or shade. Virgil's evocation of the shades influenced Fulgentius, who copies Virgil's own style of sciomancy in order to call up the persona of the poet himself to elucidate his own verse. I quote Fulgentius, "Send me now the Mantuan bard in person, so that I can bring his fugitive meanings to light. And behold, he himself comes towards me, well filled with a draught of the Ascraean spring." Fulgentius is not only interpreting the mysteries of Book 6, he's practicing them. The image of Virgil immediately appears, Fulgentius tells us, just as images of bards are accustomed to, with his tablets taken up in order to finish his work, and with a fixed frown he murmurs some mysterious truth. The boundary between magic and the business of extracting Virgil's meaning is not as secure as we might like it to be. The images and shades of Virgil in the Latin writing of late antiquity could be dismissed as a poetic convention that got out of control. But these apparitions might instead be regarded as a perfectly natural way of recognizing Virgil. The visions of the poet suggest that what we routinely call the poet's voice was being equated with a dramatic sense of the poet's presence. And those visions can actually be rationalized and better understood in terms of practices of reading that were prevalent in antiquity. The best source for ancient reading practices is St. Augustine, whose writings tell us far more about the psychology and experience of reading than classical critics and rhetoricians. Augustine approached reading through a theory of signs which was modelled on oral communication, with a conception of the relationship between sender, receiver, and sign. Reading can be seen as being comparable to interpersonal communication, though it's the reader, of course, who sets it up. And reading can provide an individual with a kind of information equivalent to that offered by sense perception. In De Trinitate, for example, Augustine explains that anyone reading or listening to the writings of St. Paul is bound to draw a picture in his mind of the apostle himself, which may or may not correspond to the features and figures formed in the minds of other readers. I quote, "When we consider any corporeal things of which we have read or heard but of which we have not seen, it's inevitable then that our mind fashions them for itself as something with bodily features and forms, just as it occurred to our thoughts. For who among those reading or hearing what St. Paul wrote, or things that were written about him, does not fashion in his mind features of the apostle himself?" Augustine's psychology of meditative reading was connected to the art of memory in classical rhetoric, which laid emphasis on visualization. Augustine had the idea that formation of a salient mental picture of an author was a standard consequence of apprehension through reading. And this provides a better understanding of why visual images of Virgil appeared to his readers. The next passage is a report of precisely this process. It's an excerpt from a letter about linguistic usage by a 9th century Christian author, Ermenric. This writer digresses from his close reading to describe how he has frequent visions of Virgil. Significantly, and these visions are not something he welcomes. I don't want to see Virgil, he says, whom I believe to be in a very bad place, and besides, the sight of him terrifies me. Often when I was reading him, and after reading him put him under my head, in that first sleep which should be sweetest after toil, there immediately appeared before me a dark monster, dreadful in every aspect. Sometimes it was brandishing a codex, other times with a pen behind its ear. It was either laughing at me, or because I was reading his words, it was mocking me. But waking up, I signed myself with the cross, and hurling his book far away, again gave my limbs to sleep. The density of references to reading is obviously meant to signal something. Ermenric makes it clear that it's after he's been reading, and reading Virgil in particular, that the apparition presents itself. The figure appearing to Ermenric also brandishes writing materials. The persona of Virgil also came to Fulgentius, equipped with stationery, quales votum in margine solo, just as the images of bards are accustomed to. The tablets, codex and pen convey that a sender, as well as a receiver, is in line with the Augustinian model of reading as an interpersonal relationship. The point is that reading might be leading to a form of voluntary or involuntary sciomancy, obviously involuntary in the case of Ermenric. Though the style of his letter as a whole recalls a rhetorical narrative of Augustine's Confessions, he still can't help importing some of Virgil's own phrases, even as he's putting the poet down. Now, Ermenric's dreams don't focus on the phantasmic creations to be found in the corpus of Virgil's poetry, Alecto or the Cyclops or Harpies or tree roots oozing blood. Those would be the stuff of nightmares for readers today, perhaps, but Ermenric's dreams focus on the character of Virgil himself. And this is strange, like someone who goes to see Alien and then has nightmares about Ridley Scott. Ermenric's visualization is more in line with Augustinian psychology than our own. Ermenric, who is neither an allegorist nor a rhetorical interpreter, shows that a salient impression of the poet's presence is what arises first and foremost from his reading of Virgil. And the late antique traditions of Latin criticism and commentary, though they differed in their objectives, shared a construction of Virgil's character, a construction which led to what we call the poet's voice, being conjoined with a more vivid impression of the poet's presence. And the readings on the apocryphal story of the dying poet's desire to burn the Aeneid also dovetail with the conception I've just outlined of a poet who continued to speak to his readers through his work, and who, even if certain contemplative forms of reading were involved, could appear to them as well. Now, these ancient intimations of the death of the author aren't news. Immortality conferred on a poet after his death and the loss of authorial control once the text is published are familiar in Roman literature. Writing has a commemorative function, which was always there in Roman culture. And Quintilian, of course, observed that letters serve as guardians of voices, returning them to readers as something once deposited. And performance traditions outside Rome provide parallels for the resurrection of the poet's voice. In archaic Greek poetry, the notion of the poet as a performer recreated in the enactment of performance is prevalent, while in troubadour poetry, the distinction between composer and performer often seems to melt away altogether. The situations and means through which classical Latin poetry was preserved and extended from one age to another are very different, of course, from those of ancient Greece or medieval France, but not completely different. For instance, the centos recycling Virgilian verses represent formulaic compositions which are rooted in a well-known text, if not in common memory. But are there any specific sources from closer to Virgil's time that might have led to the later sense of the poet's centrality as a constructed character in his own work? Might the poet himself be inadvertently responsible for his presence being dramatized or even actualized as a phantom which came to readers from the world below? I think the incipit to the Aeneid may lead to an answer. The fact that someone other than Virgil wrote those lines doesn't mean they should be disregarded altogether. No one seems to have noticed something important, which I've underlined and marked here, connecting the incipit with the real text of the Aeneid. The capital letters mark significant parallels of theme, diction, syntax and word order between these verses and the standard opening of the Aeneid. There's a correspondence of Mars to Juno at the end of the two sets of lines, but the parallel between qui quondam and qui primus is what best draws attention to the principal association A, and that's between the poet and the hero of the poem. And that association is underlined by C and D, the changes of location to which both hero and poet are subject. The poet moves from the woods to the fields to the Georgics, the hero goes from Troy to the Lavinian shores. Even if the suggestion of a parallel between Virgil and Aeneas is left aside, accommodation of the incipit would turn the Aeneid's narrator into a distinctive speaking character. The incipit is more than an optional preface that could precede the text to follow. It also functions as a frame for that text, telling us officially or unofficially that the speaker of the Aeneid is male. There are no other indications of that in the epic to follow, and it tells us that this speaker was also the singer of the Georgics and Eclogues. It's no other persona but the author himself, Virgil, whom we are hearing. Just as importantly, the incipit comments on or even recommends how the poem is to be read and received. The narrative to follow becomes embedded in the speech of the poet, whose presence is now dramatised. And this has implications for how we or readers in the past might conceive of the Aeneid in performance. The words of the speaking poet become more vivid than those of any personages he introduces. And introductae personae is the very expression Servius used for characters in Virgil's works, other than the poet himself. And there are comparable performative effects in other ancient texts. But the main point is that acceptance of this incipit would have confirmed or even promoted the inclination of readers to see Virgil as a constant dramatised presence, to hear his voice uninterrupted from one work to the next. And while the second word in the Aeneid, Kano, I sing, might alone be enough to confirm or inspire that inclination to regard the poem as a sustained monologue of an individual, the contested verses, if they were added, would have amplified that effect. And the incipit could date back to the last few years of the 1st century BC, and one of its original functions may have been to mark the Eclogues, Georgics and Aeneid as genuine works of the poet. And they have something in common with the famous tomb inscription, also attributed to Virgil. And in that inscription, topography is again used to evoke the poet's identity and to plot his trajectory, but this time Mantua, Calabria, Parthenope and the places. And the retrospective knowledge, of course, about his own death and burial, which is put into the poet's mouth, enhances a paradox which is a feature of epitaphs. Like poems can, they present the works of someone who is no longer there to speak. An epitaph might help to account for the emphasis on Virgil in particular speaking as a dead poet, but that idea could also have been fueled by the incipit. I think there's a colouring, an epitaphic colouring on Virgil's discourse, which is also found in the Sfragus to Georgics 4. The final lines of that Georgic, which Suetonius himself remarked upon, are a perfect example. At that time, sweet Parthenope was nursing me, Virgil, flowering in the pursuits of unimpressive recreation. I played the songs of shepherds and boldly in my youth sang of you to Tyrus under the cover of a shady beach. Now, we see nothing funereal or epitaphic here, mainly because we know full well that Virgil went on to write the Aeneid. But if the Georgics had been Virgil's last work, some people might well be arguing that Virgil did not write that Sfragus. The passage, even now, has been deemed a blatant misrepresentation of the poem it purports to epitomise. as things are, both the incipit of the Aeneid and the tomb inscription for Virgil were doubtless inspired by the Sphragus, especially the tomb inscription, given the recurrence of Parthenope, a word not found elsewhere in Virgil. The writers of those apocryphal texts perhaps were excavating an epitaphic significance they saw already lurking in those closing lines of Georgic 4. And it's worth considering the effect those final verses of the Georgics would have in a recitation of the poem after Virgil's death, once Octavian's triumphal progress through the East had become a historical memory. The utterance of verse 563, "At that time it was me, Virgil, sweet Parthenope was nursing," would represent a point at which the distinction between Virgil the poet and anyone writing those lines would be very pronounced. At that point, the independent identity of whoever recited the lines would be affirmed, and the absence of the original poet himself, who is lost forever, would become most acute. Indeed, the sounding of Virgil's name makes Virgil's dramatic absence more conspicuous than it is at any other point in the Eclogues, Georgics, or Aeneid. Other passages in Virgil invite reflection on reception and performance. The address to Nisus and Euryalus in Aeneid Book 9. Just as when Horace makes claims for the enduring monumentality of his work in Odes 330, it's impossible to escape having an awkward realization. We're bound to note, even if only for a moment, that the person who made those claims is indeed long gone. And the text I wanted to end with, and this is more speculative, but I think it might have something to do with the peculiar emphasis among later writers on Virgil's status as a poet who is dead, and with the sustained interest in invoking, addressing, or visualizing the presence of the poet. And this is Horace Odes 412. Which was written some 6 years after Virgil was supposedly buried in Naples. And it's the third stanza which brings in a cameo from Virgil's Eclogues, as shepherds sing with a reed pipe in honour of Pan, but it's the fourth stanza that Virgil is addressed. Horace then goes on to ask Virgil for an onyx jar of nard, which was used in Roman funeral ritual and associated with the world of the dead. That makes it clear why this is the currency Virgil is expected to use. Horace was the first writer, perhaps, to think of staging an appearance of the dead Virgil, but this was to replay the familiarity they once enjoyed. But the attempt to reprise their lost exchanges, which has perplexed modern scholars, shows how Quintilian's remark quoted earlier, that letters serve as guardians of voices, can have quite another kind of application. This invocation of Virgil is of course different from the others we've seen, because Horace appears to be feeling the lack of the poet's presence, not just as a reader, but as a friend. The status and effective divinity ascribed to Virgil by some imperial Roman authors may have had a bearing on the visions of the poet found in later Latin writers. The end of Eclogue 8 suggests that those who love might fashion dreams for themselves. For those who claim to love Virgil, a sense of the poet's presence is actually essential for a fuller appreciation of his achievement. The Eclogues, Georgics, and Aeneid are representations of pastoral, heroic, and historical worlds, but they also constitute a representation of the poet's character as an autographic imprint of Virgil himself. Thanks.
Now, please, questions or comments.
I got 4 points, and the first one is obviously thank you for your excellent paper, and I do really like your general idea that ancient readers did imagine the corporeal presence of the author. I think it's really illuminating and explains a lot. And first point is just to suggest another thing it might explain. Perhaps you have already thought about it. I mean the illustrations of Vigilius Romanus, where there are 3 images of some person sitting probably with a scroll between a capsa and a book lecture, which is sometimes regarded as not Virgil but someone who is about to recite the poem, but these images are before eclogues 2, 4 and 6, and the even-numbered eclogues differ from the odd-numbered eclogues in that they are non-dramatical. That is, dramatical eclogues are illustrated with dramatical scenes, and when something is pronounced by the poet and medieval scribes, and the scribe of the Julius Romanus as well does write in that case poeta in the margin, and probably that is you are supposed to imagine poeta. That's an excellent illustration of your point, I think. But besides, I think it will be useful to point. I think you make one mistake because the final fragment from chapter 47, I think, I brought with me the edition of the Lives of Virgil, from 47 to 66 chapters of no more to 72 in Vita Suetonio Donatiana is not without reason not reprinted in Lloyd. The reason is because it is probably not by Suetonius. You see, the text is ascribed to Donatus in the manuscript, and one manuscript even has a dedicatory letter, and the idea that it is by Suetonius belongs first to Scaliger and then to Reifferscheid, and is based on the parallels between the quotations in Jerome from the original Suetonius life. So the idea is that Donatus just incorporated, possibly with some changes, Suetonius life, but what follows on is the beginning of the commentary, so it cannot be by Suetonius because he wrote the book De Poetis. Just if you look through the text, it's all about bucolics.
Yeah, yes.
Yes.
I can answer that. Have you got another? You've got two more.
Yes, I get two more small points. The third one is it's just a small point. It might be useful for you, but you probably also know Florus, perhaps the poet who addressed Hadrian, had a book called Virgilius Orator an Poeta. The text is not preserved, but I think that's important because it means that probably it was a dialogue. Probably the opposite position also existed. That is, perhaps there were people in antiquity who thought that Virgil is not a poet. And the fourth point, the fourth point is about Horace, and it's more of a question. I think it's a beautiful explanation that Narcissus is connected with the world of the dead, but I think that to look for this explanation, the readers of 13 BC must probably, it probably implies the idea that the readers imagined Horace as sort of pronouncing the text in 13 BC. That is, that he couldn't write it earlier when Virgil is still alive. And that doesn't really seem to be the case because eclogues were published in 38 BC, but eclogue 4 is explicitly dedicated to the Council of Pollio, and it speaks about it in future tense, and the Council of Pollio was in 40 BC, so perhaps they could imagine Virgil speaking this book some years earlier. Yeah, and that's all. Thank you. Perhaps I should
Short resume. Значит, несколько соображений таких, в частности, текст, который использовался для Суетония. Да, очень коротко.
Очень коротко, да. Первое, спасибо, и, может быть, стоит соотнести эту идею с изображениями, видимо, Вергилия в рукописи Вергилиус Романус. Второе, что, по-видимому, текст, который вот вначале цитировался в качестве текста Светония, не принадлежит Светонию, потому что это комментарий к буколикам, а Светоний не писал комментарий к буколикам, видимо, это Эли Донат. Третье, что у Флора был трактат Вергилий, оратор или поэт, значит, видимо, были люди, которые считали, что все-таки не оратор. И четвертое, что объяснение про текст Горация, где он вроде бы обращается к мертвому Вергилию, да, красивое, но вопрос в том, нужно ли оно нам. Может быть, читатели могли представить себе, что тексты просто написаны за несколько лет до публикации книги, когда Вергилий еще был жив. Спасибо.
Thank you. I'll try to answer those as quickly as I can. I'll go in reverse order. The Horisode, yes, I take your point there. The thing that interested me about the poem, and it's rather like the dilemma or controversy after Boris's paper. So much of a poem depends on ancient readers in different phases. Ancient readers should always be conceived as a plurality rather than a sort of construction of a particular group of scholars at a particular time. I think my suggestion was really, although I couched it in rather fabulous terms, I admit, that the poem had the potential for that kind of interpretation if close reading of the kind we're familiar with in antiquity was applied to it. The point about Florus, yes, of course, my point wasn't so much that orators necessarily completely squished people who had poetic responses to the Aeneid, but just that people, whether they were doing rhetorical, poetic or allegorical readings, were all trying to do the same kind of thing. With the edition of, I was using Suetonius as shorthand because it was prettier than Life of Suetonius and Donatus. Yes, of course, you're completely right. And the reason that it's absent from the lobe is, of course, because it's a lobe of Suetonius. But many Anglo-American classicists use that lobe as a way of talking about the VSD, and they're pretty confident that the VSD comes to an end before that.
Yes, I just mean that it's not correct to call
No, not at all. And that was my fault for not being as precise. I just wanted to score a point. And you you actually did better. The first one on illustrations, yes, exactly. And had I had more time, there's much more that could be said about that. Particularly Ovid's Tristia 1:7, when he envisages rewriting the beginning of the Metamorphoses with the new lines that he put under his portrait, which would go at the top of the poem. And I think it's a collection of Norden's collected papers. Have you ever seen that, with a rather spooky picture of Norden himself before all the articles? Thanks very much. Wonderful questions.
Надо переводить или не надо?
Следует переводить или не надо? Last question, please. Yes. I'm sorry, we have not enough time.
Have you ever experienced the presence of ancient authors?
I need to think about it. I won't answer that immediately because I need to sort of go back.
And if so, were you frightened or not?
I think I need to think about that as well.
Okay.